In the great feasting hall of the Crimson Citadel, where 1,000 black candles burned and nobles drank blood wine from crystal goblets, a small boy's voice split the silence like a blade. "I'm so hungry. May I have your leftovers?" Layla Penrose felt the silver serving tray tilt in her grip. Finn stood beside the Vampire King's throne, her 6-year-old son, her hidden catastrophe, her greatest secret in the world, pointing one small finger directly at the untouched royal feast. He was supposed to be asleep in the servants' corridor 3 levels below. He was supposed to be invisible, as she had trained him to be. Instead, he had walked straight into the one room in the entire Crimson Citadel that could unravel everything she had spent 6 years building around them both. Every conversation stopped. Wine glasses paused mid-air. The court musicians let their instruments fall silent one by one. The royal vampire guards flanking the throne reached for the hilts of their blades. Finn did not flinch. He pointed again at the untouched plate before the most feared creature in the kingdom. "Mama didn't eat today, so I could," he explained to the room with the devastating logic of a child who believes honesty is always welcome. "If you're not going to finish it, it seems a shame to waste it." A ripple of horrified murmuring moved through the nobles. Layla's legs were already carrying her forward, trembling, wordless, her apology assembling itself in her throat before she even reached him. She could feel Lady Seraphine's contempt boring into her spine and Lord Castor's sharp, hungry attention shifting toward Finn with something that made her stomach hollow out. Then Theron turned. The Vampire King moved slowly, the way predators do when they are not afraid of anything escaping. 6 years and a throne had carved him into something colder than the man she had once known, all sharp angles and ancient stillness. Silver-white hair falling across a face that had forgotten how to be young. His eyes, the color of deep winter ice, settled on Finn. He studied the boy the way a scholar studies a text he cannot immediately translate. The silence stretched until it had weight. Layla reached Finn's side and dropped into a bow so low her dark hair swept the marble floor. "Your Majesty, forgive him. He is only a child. He doesn't understand. He understands hunger." Theron's voice was quiet, not kind, not cruel, simply final, the way stone is final. He looked at Finn for one more long, unreadable moment. Then, with a gesture so slight the room nearly missed it, he pushed his untouched plate to the edge of the table. "Eat." Finn's face broke open with relief. "Thank you, Your Majesty." But Theron's gaze had already moved. It found Layla, and something shifted behind the ice. Not recognition. Not yet. Something older and more dangerous than recognition. The faintest fracture in a wall that had been building for years. It was gone before she could be certain she had seen it. "Mrs. Penrose." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You will remain when the hall empties." It was not a command. It arrived like the first stone pulled from the base of a dam, small, almost gentle, and entirely capable of destroying everything downstream. Layla curtsied. Her fingers found Finn's hand and closed around it. She did not run. She walked steadily, her free hand pressed flat against her thigh to hide its trembling, her eyes fixed on the corridor doors ahead. She did not look back at the assembled court. She did not look back at the throne. But the question followed her through every step of that long, cold hall. What had he seen in her son's face? And how long before the rest of it came with it? If you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing. It would truly mean everything. The servants' passage beyond the feasting hall smelled of tallow smoke and damp stone, familiar and suffocating all at once. Layla did not slow her pace until they had rounded 2 corners, and the distant sound of resumed music confirmed the hall had recovered from the interruption. Finn trotted beside her, the stolen meal wrapped carefully in the cloth she had pressed into his hands at the door. "Mama," he said, "was I very bad?" She stopped at the mouth of the lower stairwell. The fear was still razor-edged in her chest, but one glance at his upturned face, earnest, worried, trying so hard to read her, and the sharpest edge of it dissolved. She knelt until they were level. "You must never enter the feast hall again without me beside you." She brushed a curl back from his brow. Her fingers were still unsteady. His small mouth pulled into a thoughtful frown. "Even if there are perfectly good leftovers going to waste? Especially then." That seems a very poor rule, he decided. And despite everything, despite the hall, despite Theron's eyes, despite the terrible words still echoing in her ears, something almost like a laugh pressed against the inside of her throat. Finn had always possessed the precise and inexplicable gift of making catastrophes feel momentarily survivable. "I only asked because you hadn't eaten," he added, quieter now. "I know." She rose, and that was kind. But sometimes kindness must be quiet. Finn glanced back toward the distant glow of the great hall's doors. He didn't seem angry. No, that was the problem. Anger she could anticipate. It had edges she knew how to navigate. But the way Theron had studied Finn, with that still, fracturing attention, had reached directly into the wound she had spent 6 years cauterizing. "He is the vampire king," she said at last. "Kings do not need to appear angry to be very dangerous." She took his hand and led him deeper into the passage. The cold stone walls pressed close around them. Layla had walked these corridors for 3 months now as Mrs. Penrose, a quiet widow, unremarkable, easily overlooked. It was a small and necessary lie. The world was considerably gentler toward widows than toward women who had loved the wrong man and been left with the evidence of it. She had come to the Crimson Citadel because she had run out of other choices. Finn's threadbare coat, the healer's fees she couldn't meet, word reaching the servant quarters of a lower city district that the Citadel required additional hands for the winter season, and that the king, everyone said, had retreated to the northern war rooms and would not return to the main halls before the frost broke. 8 weeks of wages and shelter had seemed worth the risk. Then the doors of the outer courtyard had opened on a night of hard rain, and she had been carrying linens down the servants' stair when she heard the commotion below. Through the narrow window slit, she had seen the black carriage, the red-cloaked guards, and then Theron himself stepping down into the torchlight, taller than memory, harder, dressed in the deep crimson and black of the ruling bloodline. Her hands had gone numb. The linens had slipped. For one suspended, shattering moment, she had been 20 years old again, hidden in the shadow of an ancient oak, while the man she loved looked up at the stars and told her that one day, things would be different between their two worlds. Then she pressed her back against the cold stone and reminded herself she was not Layla anymore, not to anyone here. She was Mrs. A. Penrose, dark-haired and hollowed by years, and she had changed enough that she had allowed herself, foolishly, to believe it was enough. Now, in the narrow passage below the feasting hall, the kitchen maid's whispers filtered through the vents above her head. Finn's appearance had given them material that would last for days. Laura, the head cook, stepped out of the pantry doorway and took one look at Layla's face. She cleared the passage of the younger girls with a single motion of her hand. "Into the lower stores," she said quietly to Layla. "Take the boy. Give yourself a moment." A moment, as though a moment was anywhere near sufficient to reckon with what had just begun. The private meeting was held in the map room, not the throne room. That was deliberate, Layla realized. The throne room was a performance. The map room was where Theron actually thought. She stood before a long oak table scattered with territorial charts and sealed correspondence, her hands folded, her breathing controlled. Finn was 2 floors below in the kitchen under Laura's watchful eye, eating the second meal of his life that day. The thought of him safe and fed was the only thing keeping her upright. Theron stood at the window with his back to her. The city spread below him in darkness, torchlight scattered across it like embers. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Not unkindly, simply direct. The way a man asks questions when he already knows some of the answers and is testing for the shape of what's missing. The lower settlements, Your Majesty, near the eastern ridge. And before that, I moved frequently. True. Every word of it is true. She had learned years ago that the most sustainable lies wore the clothing of facts. He turned. In the low lamplight, his face was unreadable. That same carved stillness from the feast hall. His eyes moved across her face with quiet, unhurried attention. The boy, Finn. A pause. How old? 6, Your Majesty. His father. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for this the way soldiers prepare for the wound they know is coming, not to avoid it, but to survive it. He is not part of our lives, she said. He has not been for some time. Theron was quiet for a moment. Dead, gone. Also true. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. He looked at her the way he had looked at Finn. That searching, translating quality, as though she were a text in a language he had once known and was only now remembering how to read. Then it passed. "You may go, Mrs. Penrose," he said, and turned back to the window. She curtsied and left before her legs could betray her. He could not stop thinking about the boy. Theron sat with his counsel the following morning and heard nothing of the border dispute being debated at the far end of the table. He stood in the war room that afternoon reviewing troop movements and found his mind returning without permission to a 6-year-old pointing calmly at a royal dinner plate. It seems a shame to waste. There was something in the child. Not merely boldness. Boldness was common and cheap. This was something older. A quality of stillness beneath the motion, a way of looking at things directly rather than at the space around them. Theron recognized it the way you recognize a melody heard in childhood, imprecisely, in the body rather than the mind. He issued the order quietly, through a guard he trusted. The boy was to have access to the royal gardens during the morning hours, if his mother permitted it. Layla permitted it because refusing would have drawn more attention than agreeing. Finn arrived the next morning in his worn coat and good boots, the ones Layla had resoled herself with leather from a market stall. He stood at the garden gate and looked at the hedgerows and the iron fountains and the stone ravens perched along the outer wall with the expression of someone calculating how much of this he could reasonably explore before anyone stopped him. Theron was already there. He had told himself he was reviewing the grounds. He had not told himself anything convincing enough to believe. Finn spotted him immediately. "Good morning, Your Majesty." No bow. He was working on the bow, Layla had told him, though the mechanics continued to elude him. "Did you know there are actual ravens up there? Not stone ones, real ones." "I'm aware," Theron said. "May I feed them?" Within the hour, Finn had named 3 of them. They walked the garden in the particular silence that exists between two people who are not yet accustomed to each other, but are not uncomfortable either. Finn asked questions the way he did everything. Directly, without apparent concern for whether they were appropriate. He stopped before an ancient stone figure half consumed by climbing ivy. "Who is that?" "The first king of this bloodline." Finn studied the worn face for a moment. "He looks tired." "Ruling is tiring. Is that why you don't smile very much?" Theron looked at him. "Mama says I ask too many questions," Finn offered. "Are kings lonely?" he asked, a few minutes later, at the far end of the garden. The question arrived without warning. Theron stood with it for a moment longer than he intended. "Sometimes," he said finally. Finn nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "I was lonely before Mama let me help in the kitchen. Having something to do helps." He said it with complete sincerity and moved on to inspect a frost-blackened rosebush. Theron watched him go. From the upper servants' gallery, half hidden behind a stone pillar, Layla watched them both. The fear in her chest had been constant for days now, a low, persistent pressure. But watching Theron's expression as his eyes followed her son across the garden, she felt it sharpen into something closer to dread. He was looking at Finn the way a man looks at something he is beginning to remember. She needed to leave. She had known it for days. She simply had nowhere left to go. She was still calculating the options when Finn turned back toward Theron, and the small wooden pendant at his throat swung free of his collar. A carved crescent, dark with age, worn smooth along its edges. Theron went very still. He knew that pendant. He had carved its twin himself 7 years ago, beneath a moonlit oak, for the only woman he had ever loved. He did not ask Finn about the pendant. He wanted to. The question sat at the edge of every subsequent conversation like a stone in a doorway. Present, impossible to ignore, impossible to move without committing to what came after. So Theron said nothing, dismissed the boy from the gardens with his usual quiet word, and spent the remainder of that afternoon in his study with the door bolted. He had carved 2 crescents from the same branch of a fallen oak. One he kept, one he gave to her, the night before everything ended, pressing it into her palm beneath a sky so clear every star had an edge. "So you remember this," he had said, "whatever happens." He had lost his own somewhere in the years that followed. He had stopped looking for it eventually, the way you stop looking for things that hurt to find. He pulled the memory closed and locked it, but the pendant stayed with him through dinner, through the council briefing, through the long corridor walk back to his chambers. It sat behind his eyes like a splinter, small, precise, impossible to ignore. He heard the singing just past midnight. He had not been sleeping. Sleep had become unreliable lately, crowded with things he had spent considerable effort forgetting. He was at his desk reviewing grain distribution ledgers when the sound reached him through the old stone, faint, moving through the walls the way sounds do in ancient buildings, following passages that no longer appear on any map. He knew the melody before he had consciously registered hearing it. His pen stopped moving. It was not a court song, not a hymn. It was something older and smaller than either, a song built for a single voice, for private hours, for the particular kind of grief that doesn't perform itself for anyone. He had heard it first beneath an oak tree in a human settlement at the edge of the eastern ridge, sung so quietly he had almost convinced himself he had imagined it. He had gone back the next 4 evenings until he was certain he hadn't. He was on his feet before he had made any decision to stand. The abandoned royal chapel was 3 levels down, in the oldest part of the citadel where the stonework was rough and the windows had never been fitted with glass. Candles had been lit along the altar, small ones, tallow, the kind the servants used. They threw the space into soft, uneven gold. Layla stood with her back to him, a cloth in her hands, working at the dust on the altar rail with the methodical focus of someone who has found that repetitive motion keeps certain thoughts at a manageable distance. She sang the way she always had, not performing, simply existing inside the melody. Theron stepped through the doorway. The sound of his boot on the stone floor was enough. She turned. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the densest kind, packed with 6 years of questions that had never found a recipient, with grief that had calcified into something structural, with the particular disorientation of seeing a face you had trained yourself to believe you would never see again. Layla's hand tightened on the cloth. She did not run. Not yet. Thurn stood in the doorway and looked at her the way a man looks at something he had accepted as lost, with the specific pain of an accounting that suddenly no longer balances. "You changed your hair," he said. It was not what he meant to say. You changed everything else. Nor was that what she had intended. They stood in the candlelight on opposite sides of the altar and did not move. He had believed had been shown a letter in her own handwriting, in the careful slanted script he had memorized without meaning to, that she had chosen another man, that she had left willingly, that everything they had built in the shadows of 2 hostile worlds had meant less to her than comfort and safety and someone who could offer both without consequence. She had believed, had held in her own hands a letter bearing his seal, his signature, the cold, formal language of a man closing a door, that she had been discarded, that the throne had chosen itself over her, as thrones always do, that she had been fool enough to think she was the exception. Neither of them knew they were standing inside the same lie. What surfaced instead, unbidden and unwelcome, were the other things: the oak tree, the stars, the conversation that had lasted until the sky changed color, about a world where the old hatred between their kinds might one day simply stop. His hands, her laugh, the pendant pressed warm from his palm into hers. Whatever happens. I should go, Layla said. Layla. She was already moving around the far side of the altar away from him, the cloth still clutched in both hands. He did not follow. He stood in the doorway of the empty chapel and listened to her footsteps recede through stone corridors until there was nothing left but candle smoke and silence. He remained there for a long time. Mrs. Penrose, the widow from the Eastern Ridge who moved frequently, whose son's father was simply gone, who sang, alone at midnight, a song no one else in this kingdom had any reason to know. He pressed one hand flat against the cold stone doorframe. "Why did you disappear?" he whispered. The candles did not answer, but somewhere in the dark above him a raven called once and went quiet, and Theron stood very still because the question he had just asked was no longer the right one. The right question was why she had come back. He did not confront her. He told himself it was a strategy, that he needed to understand the shape of the thing before he disturbed it. That was partly true. The other part, the part he did not examine closely, was that the chapel had cracked something open in him that he was not ready to widen further. Not yet. So he returned to the gardens, and Finn was there, as he had been every morning since the order was given, crouched beside the iron fountain with a piece of bread crust, negotiating with a raven he had named Chancellor. "He won't take it from my hand," Finn reported without looking up. "But he'll take it if I put it on the stone and walk away. Mama says that's how trust works." "Your mother is correct," Theron said. Finn squinted up at him. "Do you have to do that with people too? Walk away so they feel safe?" Theron sat on the bench beside the fountain and did not answer, which Finn accepted as philosophical rather than evasive. The clues had been accumulating for days. Theron had been cataloging them the way he cataloged everything, quietly, without conclusion, until the evidence demanded one. Finn had corrected a senior courtier's formal address without knowing it was a correction. The old vampire greeting, 2 fingers pressed briefly to the left collarbone, was not taught to human servants. Finn had done it instinctively when the courtier bowed to him, and the old man had gone pale and said nothing. The castle wolves kept in the lower courtyard had never been gentle with strangers. When Finn wandered too close to the gate on his 3rd visit, the largest of them, a gray animal with a history of violence toward anyone it didn't know, had simply lowered its enormous head and allowed Finn to scratch behind its ears. Theron had watched from the upper walkway and felt something cold move through him that was not quite dread and not quite wonder. And there were the servants, the oldest ones who remembered the years before the throne, before the Chancellor's reforms, before everything that Theron had been reshaped into by necessity and grief. He caught them looking at Finn with the particular expression of people who recognize something they are not certain they are permitted to say aloud. He knew that expression. He had worn it himself in the chapel doorway, looking at a woman he had spent 6 years believing was gone. Layla came to him. He had not summoned her. He was in the eastern corridor after the morning council when he heard her footsteps, quick, deliberate, the walk of someone who has made a decision before they are fully certain they can sustain it. He turned and she was there, and one look at her face told him that whatever she had been holding was no longer holdable. "Not here," he said. He took her to the map room, closed the door, said nothing, because he had learned long ago that silence was the most efficient way to let people find the words they had already found, but not yet spoken. Layla stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him directly for the first time since the chapel. "Finn is your son." The map room was very quiet. Theron stood with those 4 words, rearranging everything behind his eyes. He did not question her. The pendant, the walls, the old greeting, the servants' faces, the way Finn looked at him sometimes. Searching, comfortable, familiar in a way that had no rational explanation. He had known. Some part of him had known since the feast hall, since the moment he looked into silver-gray eyes that had no business existing in a human child's face. He turned to the window. What hit him was not anger, not disbelief. It was grief, sudden, structural, the kind that takes the load-bearing walls with it. He stood in it and let it do what it was going to do. He had missed his son being born. He had missed first words. Whatever Finn's first word had been, some other room had held it, some other set of walls. First steps. 6 birthdays. 6 years of questions directed at the air beside an empty space that should have been filled. "Show me the letter," he said finally. His voice was level. He had worked very hard to make it level. Layla reached into the fold of her apron and produced a piece of paper so worn at the creases it had nearly separated into pieces. She set it on the table. Theron read it. His own seal. His own signature. Cold, formal, final. The language of a man closing a door on something he had decided was finished. He had never written it. He crossed to the document chest against the wall and found the letter within minutes. He had kept it because he had spent years trying to understand it, folded inside a territorial map of the eastern settlements. He set it beside hers on the table. They both read the others. The silence this time had a different quality. It was the silence of 2 people watching the architecture of 6 years of pain simply collapse. "I never wrote that," Layla said. "Nor I that." She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her eyes were bright and dry in the way of someone who ran out of tears for this particular wound a long time ago. Theron looked at both letters side by side on the map table. The same hand, he now realized. The same construction. Built to destroy something specific, by someone who had understood exactly what needed to be severed and where to apply the blade. He said quietly, "Someone stole our lives." He told no one. This was deliberate. Whoever had forged those letters had done so from inside the citadel, had access to his seal, knowledge of his handwriting, understanding of exactly which words would make Layla believe the man she loved had discarded her without ceremony. That was not the work of an outside enemy. That was intimate knowledge precisely applied, which meant the investigation had to be invisible. The moment it became visible, evidence would disappear. Witnesses would develop convenient failures of memory. And Layla and Finn, already exposed simply by existing inside these walls, would become liabilities someone might decide to resolve permanently. Theron began the way he began everything that mattered. Quietly, systematically, without revealing his destination to anyone watching his direction. The palace archives occupied the lower eastern wing, 3 vaulted rooms of correspondence, ledgers, and territorial records maintained by a rotating staff of scribes who catalogued everything and understood very little of what they held. Theron visited after the second evening bell when the scribes had gone and only the dust remained. He was looking for a specific window, the 6 weeks surrounding his diplomatic mission to the eastern settlements 7 years prior. Correspondence logs, messenger records, any document that passed through the Citadel's internal mail during that period. What he found was a gap, not a dramatic gap, not the kind that announces itself, a subtle one. 3 weeks of outgoing correspondence meticulously recorded, and then 8 days where the entries were present but the physical letters they referenced were absent from the filing boxes. Someone had removed the originals and left the index intact. An archivist checking the catalog would find nothing wrong. Only someone who needed the letters themselves would notice they were gone. Theron noted the dates. Note the archivist's initials on the relevant entries. Said nothing and left. The accounting records took longer. He worked through them across 4 nights, reviewing expenditure logs from the Chancellor's administrative office during the relevant period. Most of it was routine: supply requisitions, staff wages, maintenance costs. He was nearly through the third ledger when a line entry stopped him. Courier service, special dispatch, Eastern Settlements route, remittance, private account, authorization, HCM, 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 High Chancellor Malik. The amount was significant, far beyond standard courier rates, and the account number it referenced appeared nowhere else in the official records, a private channel funded from the Chancellor's discretionary budget, leaving almost no trace except a single line that someone had apparently considered too minor to bother removing. Theron copied the account number carefully and closed the ledger. He found the courier through the messenger logs. It took 2 weeks of cross-referencing, names, routes, dates, retirement records. The man was elderly now, living in the lower city on a pension that was, Theron noted, considerably more generous than the standard retirement allowance for a courier of his rank. Theron went to him without guards, without ceremony, dressed in the plain dark clothing he kept for occasions when being the Vampire King was a disadvantage. He knocked on the door at dusk and waited. The old man opened it, took one look at his visitor's face, and went the color of old ash. He confessed within the hour, not because Theron threatened him, he didn't, but because the old man had been carrying it for 7 years and the weight had apparently become insupportable. He sat at his kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea and told the whole of it in a flat, exhausted voice. High Chancellor Malik had approached him directly. 2 letters to be intercepted, one outgoing, one incoming, both on the Eastern Settlements route. 2 replacement letters, already prepared, to be substituted and delivered. The originals to be destroyed. The payment to be drawn from an account that would never be traced back to anyone who mattered. The old man had told himself it was a political matter, that it wasn't his business, that the money would see his daughter through her first winter. He had told himself many things. "I knew," he said quietly, "when the king never married, when he stopped going to the settlements entirely." He looked at his hands. "I knew it hadn't been nothing." The day after the courier's confession, the archive index for that 8-day window was found damaged. Water, apparently, from a leaking pipe in the ceiling above. The ledger Theron had reviewed was gone from its shelf, replacement records in its place. Someone knew he was looking. He moved Layla and Finn that same night, quietly, presented as a routine reassignment of quarters. 2 trusted guards placed on their corridor under the explanation of a general security review. Layla understood without being told. She packed what mattered, took Finn's hand, and asked no questions, which told him she had already known this day was coming. More witnesses surfaced in the following days. A retired lady's maid, a former palace steward with a memory for faces and figures. Each had seen something small, something individually meaningless. Together they were beginning to form a shape. Then, behind a false panel in the Chancellor's outer office, located through the account number, traced to a private strongbox, Theron found the ledger. Names, dates, payments, every transaction Malric had made across 7 years of careful, patient conspiracy, recorded in his own hand with the methodical confidence of a man who had never once considered that the king might come looking. Every lie was in there, all of them connecting, finally, like bones assembling into something that had always had a shape. The annual Royal Blood Assembly convened on the first night of the frost moon, as it had for 3 centuries. Every noble family of the Vampire Kingdom sent representatives. They filled the great hall in their formal blacks and crimsons, arranged by bloodline seniority in the tiered galleries that curved around the central floor like the inside of a cupped hand. The chandeliers held 500 candles each. The royal vampire guards lined the walls in full ceremonial armor. It was the one night of the year when the full weight of the kingdom assembled itself in a single room and remembered what it was. Malric arrived early, as he always did. He took his position at the Chancellor's podium, to the left of the throne, with the particular ease of a man who had stood there so long he had forgotten it was not his by right. He reviewed his prepared agenda. He exchanged measured greetings with the senior lords, He gave no indication that anything was different about this evening. He had heard rumors, of course, quiet ones. A courier visited, an archive accessed after hours, a ledger briefly missing from its shelf before reappearing, or something appearing in its place that was sufficiently similar that only a careful eye would notice the difference. He had taken precautions. He had people he trusted in the right positions. He had survived 4 kings and 2 coups through the simple discipline of never allowing a single point of failure. He was not concerned. Theron entered last, as protocol required, and took the throne without ceremony. He looked, as he always looked, like a man carrying the specific weight of absolute authority, composed, distant, sufficient unto himself. He surveyed the assembled hall once and said nothing. Malric introduced the first agenda item. Theron let him finish the sentence. Then he said, "Set it aside." The hall stirred. Malric's hands stilled on his papers. "Your Majesty, there is one matter before this assembly tonight." Theron rose from the throne, unhurried, as though what was about to happen had already happened and he was simply allowing the room to catch up. "Everything else can wait." He began with the letters. A guard carried them forward on a wooden tray. Both originals, recovered from the courier's testimony and cross-referenced against handwriting samples from the Citadel's document records. Theron held them up so the tier galleries could see the seals. He described in precise and unhurried language what each letter contained, what each letter claimed, and what each letter had been designed to accomplish. The hall was very quiet. He moved to the messenger logs next. The gap in the archive index. The account number in the expenditure records traced across 3 separate ledgers to a private fund maintained outside the official treasury, a fund that had no legitimate administrative purpose and no authorization beyond the initials of one man. Malric said, "These are forgeries. Someone has constructed a—" "You will have an opportunity to speak," Theron said without looking at him. "This is not that moment." The elderly courier came forward from the side door where he had been waiting. He walked slowly and did not look at Malric. He spoke to the assembly in the same flat, exhausted voice he had used at his kitchen table. Dates, amounts, instructions received, letters exchanged. When he finished, he sat in the chair provided for him and did not move again. The retired lady's maid followed. Then the former steward. Each account was small. Each account was small. Each account was precise. Each account added one more piece to the shape that was becoming undeniable. Then Layla walked in. The hall reacted, a ripple of recognition from those who had seen her in the feast hall weeks prior, a ripple of calculation from those now rapidly reassessing what her presence meant. She wore the same plain dress she always wore. She carried herself the way she had learned to carry herself in years of surviving rooms that were not designed for her. She told the truth, all of it, where she had come from, what she had been told, what she had believed, what she had done with that belief for 6 years. Her voice did not shake when she finished. She met Theron's eyes across the floor of the hall and then stepped back. Malric's denial, when it came, was detailed and confident and completely without foundation because Theron had spent 3 weeks making certain that every foundation had been removed before this night. He let Malric finish. Then he placed the ledger on the Chancellor's own podium. The silence that followed was the most complete silence the Great Hall had produced in 3 centuries of assemblies. Malric looked at it the way a man looks at something he was certain he had destroyed. His hands, resting on the podium, did not move, but the stillness in them was the stillness of a structure that has just lost its load-bearing support. The senior lords called for a reading. The ledger was read aloud by the chief archivist, entry by entry, name by name, payment by payment, across 7 years of meticulous and catastrophic record-keeping. When it was done, the assembly did not need to deliberate. Malric and 4 senior accomplices were stripped of title, lands, and authority before the candles had burned down another inch. The orders were signed. The guards moved. It happened with the quiet efficiency of a kingdom that had been waiting, without knowing it, for the machinery of justice to finally find the right document. Theron watched it conclude. Then he turned. Finn stood at the edge of the hall in his good coat, Layla's hand in his, watching everything with silver-gray eyes that understood more than any 6-year-old should have needed to. The entire court followed the king's gaze and found the boy. The court was still watching Finn when Tyrion reached up and removed his crown. It was a small motion, unhurried. He set it on the arm of the throne with the same care he might set down something fragile, and then he stepped away from it, away from the dais, away from the chancellor's empty podium, away from the tiered galleries and the 500 candles in 3 centuries of accumulated ceremony, and walked across the floor of the great hall toward a 6-year-old boy in a good coat. No one spoke. The royal vampire guards did not move to intercept him, because there was nothing in their training for this. The senior lords did not murmur to one another, because there was nothing in their experience for this either. The hall simply held its breath and watched the vampire king cross the marble floor like a man who had finally, after a very long time, identified the correct direction. He stopped before Finn. Then he knelt. Not the formal kneel of ceremony. One knee, back straight, head inclined at the prescribed angle. He knelt until he and Finn were level, until there was nothing between their faces but candlelight and 6 years of stolen time, and the hall watched a king make himself small before a child and understood, collectively and without anyone explaining it, that they were witnessing something that would outlast every political event that had preceded it tonight. Theron's voice, when it came, was not the voice he used for counsels or commands or the careful architecture of public speech. It was quieter than that, rougher at the edges. I should have been beside you from the day you were born. He held Finn's gaze and did not look away. I should have been there for every day that came after. I wasn't. That is not something I can repair. A pause. But I would like, if you'll allow it, to be there for every day that remains. Finn was very still. His silver-gray eyes, Theron's eyes, the hall was realizing, one face after another making the same silent calculation, were bright, and his small mouth was pressed into the particular line of a child, working very hard to be as brave as the moment requires. If you become my father, Finn said carefully, does that mean Mama won't have to skip meals anymore? Something moved across Theron's face that the assembled nobles would describe differently depending on who was asked. Grief, some said later. Love, said others. The particular expression of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of what was taken from him and chosen in the same moment not to be destroyed by it. He reached out and drew Finn into his arms. Never again, he said. Not for either of you. Never again. Finn's arms went around his neck with the complete and uncomplicated trust of a child who had, apparently, already made his own decision about this some time ago, and had simply been waiting for the adult to catch up. His small shoulders shook once, and then he was still, and Theron held his son in the middle of the great hall and let the silence be what it was. Then he rose, Finn's hand in his, and turned to face the court. Finn Penrose is my son. His voice filled the hall without effort, the way it always did, but the quality was different now. Not the cold authority of command, something older and less constructed than authority. He is of my blood, of my line, and by every law this kingdom holds, the rightful heir to the throne of the Crimson Citadel. The eruption was not immediate. It moved through the galleries in a wave. Disbelief first, then the rapid, audible recalculation of every political position in the room. Then something that in a different gathering might have been called wonder, a half-human child, an heir born of the love that the kingdom's most powerful man had spent 7 years trying to prevent. Theron let them have their noise. Then he turned to Layla. She had not moved from where she stood at the edge of the hall. She was watching him with an expression he recognized, the one she wore when she was feeling something large and had not yet decided what to do with it. He crossed to her. The court watched. I looked for reasons, he said quietly, for her alone. After the letter, I told myself there were signs I had missed, things that made it possible. I wanted it not to be true, and I looked for reasons anyway, and I found them, because grief will find what it goes looking for." He paused. "I should have looked harder for the truth. I should have looked until I found you. I'm sorry that I didn't." Layla was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "We were given the same lie," she said, "by the same hands. I spent 6 years being angry at you for a letter you never wrote. A breath. I think we've both served enough time for crimes we didn't commit." He offered his hand. She took it. Months later, the Crimson Citadel smelled different. It was a small thing. The kind of change that accumulates gradually and becomes noticeable only when someone thinks to compare the present against the past. That the kitchens ran warmer now, and the lower corridors carried the scent of bread in the evenings, and the servants moved through the halls with the quality of ease that had not been there before. Layla no longer carried linens or polished altar rails at midnight. She sat instead in the council chamber 2 mornings a week beside advisors who had initially arranged their faces into careful neutrality at her presence and had since, gradually grudgingly, and then genuinely, come to understand that she saw things they missed. She was building something, slowly and methodically, a framework for human subjects inside the kingdom's legal structure, protections that had never existed, represented by someone who had lived the absence of them. Finn had lessons every morning: history, diplomacy, languages, and what his tutor privately described to Theron as an absolutely exhausting commitment to asking why after every single statement of established fact. He was, the tutor reported with a mixture of exasperation and unmistakable admiration, the most relentlessly curious student the Citadel's teaching staff had encountered in living memory. He had also, within his first week as acknowledged heir, proposed a formal policy regarding royal banquet leftovers. Theron had read the proposal, 3 pages, written in a 6-year-old's careful handwriting with a diagram, and signed it the same afternoon. Now, on banquet nights, the servants ate first. Whatever remained went to the lower city distribution points that Layla had spent 2 months establishing, staffed by volunteers who had responded to the notice with a speed that suggested the need had always been there, waiting only for someone to acknowledge it. On this particular evening, Theron stood at the gallery window above the great hall and watched his son move along the banquet table below, checking portions, speaking to the kitchen staff with the focused seriousness of someone who considers this the most important work of the evening, which he does. Finn paused to say something to one of the younger kitchen girls that made her laugh, and then he looked up, found his father in the gallery window, and raised one hand in a small wave. Theron raised his hand in return. Below him, the hall that had once fallen silent at the voice of a hungry child was filled with warmth and motion, and the particular sound of a kingdom in the early and fragile stages of becoming something better than it had been. The boy who had once asked for leftovers was making certain with the absolute conviction of someone who sees no reason why the answer should be anything other than yes, that no one inside these walls would ever need to ask the same question again. Theron watched him and understood, for the first time in a long time, that the most consequential thing he had ever done as king had nothing to do with thrones or laws or assembled nobility. It had happened in a candlelit hall when a frightened child pointed at an untouched plate, and he had looked up